Hello, hi. Welcome to my first online learning. So this is actually part one of the lecture Threat and Conservation of Biodiversity. So for this topic, I'm going to focus only on threat, and the next part is going to be focused on the conservation of biodiversity. So I hope that after this online learning, you could determine the factors of biodiversity loss and also the threats for biodiversity. And for the next lecture, I hope that you could state the action for conserving the biodiversity. So threats to biodiversity. So the thing about loss of biodiversity, it could lead to extinction, where the last individual of a species is actually gone and you couldn't find it throughout the world. Let's say if we have so many species gone relatively in a short period of time, so we call that as a mass extinction. So scientists, biologists, they have predicted that by the year 2100 there will be a lot of other species will have to become extinct, and I think you know why. One of it is because of human population is actually growing. So whenever human population is growing, it will come along with the increment of the consumption, and because of that we need to convert all those forests, grassland and wetland to become agriculture and also for urban development. One example is for residential area. So for you to understand this, there is something what we call as a hippo dilemma. So what is hippo dilemma? No, not you, Gloria. Okay, so hippo is actually an acronym. H stands for habitat loss and fragmentation, I for introduced species, P for population growth, and another P is for pollution, and another one is actually O, over consumption. So for this habitat loss, complete loss of habitat and also degradation is actually the most serious threat to biodiversity, because the habitat is where all the organisms inhabit. And as you learn in evolution, adaptation, all the species is actually have been adapted to live in that kind of habitat throughout the years. So if the habitat is lost, then they have no other place to go. One of our example is actually fragmentation. Let's say you have one piece of land, and then you clear down one part of the forest here and then another part of the forest there, and then the forest will become fragmented and there will be a loss of connection. So the main cause for this always is because of human activities. One of it is because of agriculture, mining, and development of human settlement. All of this is actually interconnected with each other. Okay, so the next one is introduced species. How you define this introduced species is by a species which is introduced beyond their native evolutionary range. So meaning that, as what you learn from evolution and adaptation, all the species is actually adapted to stay or live in that kind of habitat, of course through years of evolution and also adaptation. So you can say that they are actually couldn't go beyond that unless they are being introduced. So some books they use the word exotic species, non-native species, non-indigenous, alien. All of this is actually referring to the same introduced species. So you might be wondering, if we are introducing a new species to one particular place, isn't it going to add more biodiversity? Logically, yes, but as time passes by, it might actually become a problem later on, because this introduced species is actually invading the native communities of the ecosystem. They also can have quite an undesirable from an ecological perspective, because they can cause a modification to the species richness, abundance, and also the ecosystem function of that native place. So this introduced species is actually considered to be among the most damaging agent to habitat alteration and also degradation of the world. If you're interested, you can actually go to this website, www.investorspecies.gov. This is like a database where people around the world, especially the biologists, they can actually contribute in letting know the scientific communities whether there is actually a new species just happen to be introduced at one particular area. So how will introduced species become a problem is that they often preying on the native organism and also competing the native species for resources. Resources here you can put it in terms of food, water, space, and many others. So there have been cases that the species can actually threaten the native species, as what you learn through evolution and also adaptation. If you know that you have predators that are going to prey on you, certainly you are going to develop some kind of defense mechanism. So if at all sudden there's a new organism coming, and you didn't know how to tackle or how to counter, okay, this kind of organism, you don't know whether are they friend or are they become your enemy, and all of a sudden you got eaten. So this is actually the thing that happened with this introduced species and also the native species. So throughout the historical event, we actually have a few case study. So one of it is like nine perch, red foxes, and so brown tree snakes. So reason for species introduction is always by or because of human activity. So there have been cases where we introduce a kind of plant to restore a degraded habitat, and then sometimes we just introduce species because it has this aesthetic and ornamental demands. I think we can relate this with our previous lectures. And then we always bring some organism, okay, because you can use it as a crops or livestock. Again, ornamental and landscaping. Sometimes you could even keep it as a pet. You might use it as a biological control without knowing what could happen in the future, and so on. So how this thing can be introduced, although sometimes it can be intentionally, it can also be accidentally. And knowing now, you know that the term everyone can fly, anyone can fly. So this all kind of increased travel and trade is actually providing new opportunities for the species to be introduced beyond their evolutionary range. So these are just a few: container traffic, ballast water, because of through forestry, and so on. So let's say for this air traffic, there have been cases that the mosquito has actually survived a flight from Africa to Britain in a passenger cabin. So let's say you are from West Malaysia and then you come to Sarawak. You wouldn't know that actually there might be a mosquito or maybe a cockroach that you bring along from Peninsular Malaysia to here. So we don't know that. Same goes with this kind of air traffic. And then there also have been this brown tree snake. They have been traveling in cargo base from Guam to Hawaii. So this is during the World War. There have been cases. And then this brown tree snake, this is actually accidentally introduced because this snake more like creeping in, okay, into the military cargo. So you can call the brown tree snakes a stowaway. So once they got introduced in Guam, so Guam is actually an island. So you know how sensitive an island ecosystem is. So they have quite a number of species of birds and also lizard. And people have been like studying how come all the birds and lizard species is actually gone. And it's all because of this brown tree snake. So what happened is that this brown tree snake, they prey on the birds, and without the birds the tree couldn't disperse their seeds much further. So this is how you can see that an introduced species could actually altering or moderate the habitat community. So like this brown tree snake, it is not only affecting the birds but also the tree seed dispersal as well. Then for this agriculture perspective, yes, we have this one what we call as a kudzu. Because of the root work system, so this kudzu is actually used to help control the erosion. Okay, however, little did they know is that the kudzu is very fast in growing, and they have this kind of habit, which is covering all the other plant, competing for the sunlight. So because of this, the native tree couldn't get enough sunlight for them to produce or perform a photosynthesis. And you know that in the end, without photosynthesis, the tree itself is going to die. So the things that live is only the kudzu. And same goes with this one, part of aquaculture. This Nile perch has been introduced in East Africa in a lake. I think you still remember how many times that I told you about how sensitive is a lake ecosystem as well, because anything happen in that lake, the animals there, they couldn't fly away. I mean, all the fishes, they couldn't like fly away or walking to some other lakes. So this Nile perch is happen to be a very ferocious predator. So this Nile perch is actually consuming and eating all the other native fish species. Okay, so the thing about this introduced species, they become actually a threat to biodiversity. So for the direct effect, it can compete for resources with the native organism, and just like the brown tree snake cases, the snake itself can actually alter the habitat and also the community. How I mentioned about the snake actually prey on the birds, and the bird is actually affecting the dispersal of the seed for the tree, and so on. And because of all the native organism doesn't have this kind of natural defense mechanism, so they are going to be preyed on by the introduced species, and of course it's going to impact on the other fauna. For the indirect effects, let's say for example the case of a mosquito, you wouldn't know what kind of parasites or what kind of diseases that the species bring from one place to another, and then you wouldn't know that the introduced species could actually hybrid and creating some kind of like super species which is super predator. We wouldn't know that, but the possibilities are always there. Okay, this is one case of the European starling. A citizen group intend to introduce all the plants and animals mentioned in the Shakespeare's play. I think we discussed about this in the value of biodiversity. So what happened is that this group of people imported 120 starlings to the New York Central Park, and after years, all these 120 have become like millions of birds. So what happened is that it displaced many of the native songbird species in US and also Canada. And the funny thing is that this European starling is actually just mentioned in just one line of the Henry IV. Okay, so another threat to the biodiversity is actually the population growth. I've checked this. Despite of the COVID-19 recent cases, there are actually 7.773 billion humans living on Earth currently. Although there also have been death every day, but the rate of the birth is still way more than the rate of the death. So in 2200, United Nations actually predict that our population will be stabilized, meaning that it has reached the carrying capacity, the limited sources that the Earth can provide for the population. So these are actually what things that actually happen throughout the years. Although we are now we haven't reached 8 billions yet, and actually we reached 7 billion way earlier than 2013. If I'm not mistaken, there is actually a celebration for that. And we are actually getting close to 8 billion, and it's not even 2028 yet. Okay, so another threat for the biodiversity is actually the pollution. And of course, the pollution came from the human as well. As the population consume, okay, it is going to leave a trace of waste, and this could actually become the source of the pollution. So pollution can be present in many forms. It can be the air, it can be in the soil, it can be in the water, it can be in form of pesticides. Okay, so all of this is actually a source of threats to biodiversity. The next threat would be overconsumption. As the human population is growing, so does our consumption. Okay, for this threats to biodiversity, which is the overconsumption, we can actually learn from Easter Island. Something happened in the Easter Island. Easter Island is a very remote island in Chile. Okay, so for this Easter Island, there have been like original inhabitants, which are the Polynesians. So from the record, there have been an evidence of the pollen grains in the soil, meaning that the island used to be forested with a wide varieties of trees. So the Polynesian, they developed civilization based on the resources that they have, which are the giant palms and also the basswood. So life was good. So meaning that the population can grow. Sounds familiar? So by year 1400, the population was growing. So to meet the demand, all the forests were actually cleared to plant crops. And the thing about the resources, they use it much faster than they could be renewed. So meaning that this is actually not happen sustainably, obviously. So what happened? To support the growing population, the resources become inadequate. So they believe this is some kind like a warning from the gods. So they carve a huge divine image from a large stone, so to appeal the god, saying that please help us, save us from this kind of misery. So by the year 1600, all the trees were gone. So that is why if you look at Easter Island now, there hardly any forested area there. So what happened? The forest has been depleted, and then all the soil and water resources has already been degraded in terms of quality, and of course there have been fight among them to fight for the resources. So the thing that happened is starvation, and also the diseases become epidemic, and without any trees left, they couldn't move to another islands. And does this sound familiar too? So in 1722, there has been like a Dutch explorer reached the island on Easter days. So now you know why the Easter Island is called Easter Island. So this is to show that when a society fails to take care of the environment, yes, of course you can use it, but if you use it in not in a unsustainable way, then there is a tendency for the civilization to collapse. Okay, although this is not part of the hippo dilemma, this is also can become a threat to biodiversity. The first one will be wildlife poaching. Okay, poaching is another threat that actually emerged in recent decades because there have been a demand for it. So this include the live specimen of the animal or plant which is used for folk medicines, and then fur, skin and other products. This one can actually become part of the decoration or ornaments. This is part of the cost for wildlife poaching. There have been cases in Singapore where actually this is not something that we can be proud of. World record haul on pangolin scales worth 52 million Singapore dollars. So this is quite a lot of money. And then looking at the photo here, can you imagine how many pangolins were there just to get all these bags of scales? And I think you know about this, like the tiger skin that you can hang on, or you can make like a rugs, and all this ivory that you can use for decoration. So this is actually the things about poaching and become a threat to biodiversity. And so man-wildlife conflict, of course, let's say if there's a conflict between man and also wildlife, people will always blaming the wildlife. So the thing about this conflict, we always actually blaming on the wildlife. Okay, although if you trace back what could be the cause of the problem, it's always the human, because we encroach their natural habitat, because we want to build, for example, residential area. We clear the forest for the agricultural field, aquaculture, for example. So this is going to make them lack of stable food, and also disruption of movement, for example the fragmentation, and of course conflict will happen. Okay, and the last one is actually the climate change. This is what Greta Thunberg always say, how dare you. So the thing about climate change is going to threaten the species and also the ecosystem. So you know that what you learn from evolution and adaptation, all the species actually being distributed in their native evolutionary range, meaning that they are actually used to that kind of climate or temperature. So let's say if something happened because of due to this climate change, it's going to shift all this distribution. So for example, for this moth study at Mount Kinabalu, there was a study done at 1965, and then there was another exact same study being done in year 2007. So what they can find is that the moth from the lower altitude is actually climbing towards the higher altitude due to this climate change. So the problem here is, yes, of course, if you're from the lower altitude, you can always get into high altitude because you want to get the same kind of temperature, which is colder. As you go higher, it's going to be colder. But what if you're already at the top of the altitude, the highest? Where else you can go? So this could be actually could be a part of the okay, and then part of this climate change is going to change the sex ratio in reptiles. So for example, turtles or lizard, it has been a study being done saying that higher temperature will result in more female than male, which is not good for the genetic diversity. And then for the shorebirds, they're going to be affected because they lose the feeding area. So how to mention this is that there have been an area which is used to be a sandbar during the low tide, but due to the climate change, the Arctic is actually melting, and then the amount of seawater is actually increasing. So a place where it used to be sandy or sandbar during the low tide, it might not no longer become a sandbar. Okay, so for this, the shorebird is actually affected because this shorebird, they usually always feeding during the low tide. So these are among the things that we can discuss on later on. So I think that's all. Thank you.